Hi everyone and welcome to my channel. I am really excited about today's video. I have wanted to debut some of my eyeshadow palettes for a while. However, my C palette has been full. This one is the extra large C palette and I debuted some palettes to this palette last year and there's no more room. So I recently got a new C palette. This one is the double-sided C palette, so there's two sides of the large C palette here. And yeah, I'm finally able to debut some of the palettes I have wanted to debut. I'm planning on making 3 parts to this series, if you can call this a series, but today we are going to be selecting the palettes I will debut. In the next video I'm actually going to be debuting those palettes and then going through the shades and decide what eyeshadows I'm going to keep and what eyeshadows I'm getting rid of. And then in the last video I'm going to be rearranging my singles. So I do have all of my eyeshadow palettes here and I'm going to go through them one by one and I will make the decision if I'm going to debut it or not, and I will explain my reasons to you. So let's just start. I thought I would start by pulling out some palettes I know for sure I am not going to be debuting, and there's a couple of palettes that I cannot debut because the eyeshadows are not pressed in pans, they are actually pressed straight into the palette, so it's not possible to debut those. So the first one is my Baby Panda palette. This is the e.l.f. Prism eyeshadow palette in Naked. So this is what the palette looks like. As you can see, there's one shade missing. Mine is broken and the plastic thing where the eyeshadows are pressed comes off. It one day just like popped out of the palette and I had a casualty with the white eyeshadow. But yeah, as you can see, it's not possible to debut this palette, so I just need to keep it the way it is. Then I am pretty sure that this Seattle London Olivia Palermo palette is similarly pressed into the plastic thing in the bottom of the palette than the e.l.f. palette. I mean, I'm not 100% sure because I have not yet hit pan. However, when I look at the eyeshadows, it doesn't seem like there's pan at all. I can just see this plastic thing and there's these 4 eyeshadows that are in weirdly shaped pans. I just don't think they are in actual metal pans. And you know what? Even if this was something I could debut, I still wouldn't debut it because I think the palette is perfect the way it is. This is my perfect rose gold plum eyeshadow palette and I love it and I do want to keep it the way it is. Okay, so next I'm going to pull out the palettes I'm panning or considering panning, and I just realized that I don't have my Panda palette over here, so let me just pick it up. It is over here. So the Anastasia Beverly Hills Modern Renaissance. This palette I am panning. It's much easier to pan if it is, you know, in the original palette, in the original covers. So no point to debut this palette, but hopefully I could finish, if not the complete palette this year, at least most of the shades. Then this is a palette I'm thinking of making my Panda palette next year. This is the BH Cosmetics Modern Matte Eyeshadow Palette. The packaging is broken and it's so annoying, so that's one reason why I would like to pan it. Another reason is that there's a lot of these neutral matte eyeshadows that I have so much in my collection, so it would make sense to pan this. And after panning this for a year, then debut this palette and keep those shades that I really like. So because of that, I am not going to be debuting this palette right now. And anyways, there's 28 eyeshadows in this palette. They would take way too much space in my C palette. And then a palette I might consider panning after the BH Cosmetics one is my original Too Faced Chocolate Bar palette. This is my oldest eyeshadow palette, so it's going to be 5 years old this year, so it would really make sense to pan this at some point. It still performs very well and when I open it, it still smells chocolate, so it's not like it's expired, but you know, I would like to get it used up, and I think the color story in this palette is totally something I could pan. It's quite neutral, like warm neutral, but it doesn't pull way too warm so that I would only be able to create orange looks. Okay, so now that we have pulled out some palettes I know for sure I'm not going to be depotting, I thought I could pull out two palettes that I know for sure I will depot. Those palettes were something that inspired me to get a new C palette and start depotting. So first is my Juvia's Place Tea Douche eyeshadow palette. I know many people love this color story, and I feel I'm like the only person in this world that doesn't really like this color story. Like, I don't say I want to have super large eyeshadow palettes all the time, but I think if I have a 9-pan palette, the color story should be really cohesive and all of the shades should go together. And in my opinion, that's not the case with this palette. And also another reason why I do want to depot this palette is that there's a couple of eyeshadows that I really dislike and I just want out of my collection. So this is a palette I'm for sure going to be depotting. Another eyeshadow palette I know for sure I'm going to be depotting is the BH Cosmetics Carly Bible Deluxe Edition palette. I love this palette and I'm going to be depotting it for very different reasons than the Juvia's Place one. This I want to depot because it takes so much space, and also most of the highlighters in this palette are gone, couple I finished, and the two darker ones I just crashed out. With this palette I do really think the color story is cohesive and I love this color story. It's one of my favorite color stories in my entire collection. I love how many things you can do with only 15 eyeshadows that are in this palette. However, I just don't want to have a palette that takes this much space anymore, and I don't want to have highlighters in eyeshadow palette. I rather want to have these highlighters with my other depotted blushes and highlighters. I do have a separate magnetic palette for those. Next, I think I'm again going to pull out palettes I know I'm not going to be depotting this time because I just like the palette and the color story the way it is. First one is the Juvia's Place The Nubian 2 eyeshadow palette. I love this color story. This is one of my favorite palettes for like the end of summer and then fall time. It's so beautiful and I think all of the shades go together. Also, these shades are huge, so they would take a lot of space in my C palette. Of course, the eyeshadows in the Douche palette are same size. However, that palette I really want to depot. This one I'm happy to have this way, so I'm not going to be depotting it. Next is my Kat Von D Shade and Light Eye Contour palette. I do have already a lot of basic matte eyeshadows in my C palette because I have depotted the Balm Meat Matte palettes, the Meat Matte Nude and the Meat Matte Trimony, and from some palettes I'm going to be depotting. Now there will be more basic matte eyeshadows coming to my C palettes, so no point for me to depot this one too. And I do love the palette the way it is. Like, it has all of my basic mattes I would ever need, and I always want to have my basic matte eyeshadow palette, so I don't really have any reason to depot this palette. I don't think I'm going to depot my Urban Decay Naked Smoky eyeshadow palette, at least yet. I do have this sentimental attachment to this palette because this used to be my party palette and it has traveled with me to different festivals and events. And I love this palette. The packaging is beautiful. I think this is like my favorite packaging in my eyeshadow collection. So it's this cool toned, really smoky eyeshadow palette. The only thing I would change about this palette is that I would put a super icy silver here to replace one of these more kind of like smoky silvers. But other than that, I think this palette is perfect the way it is, and I'm not ready to depot this palette yet. But this is for sure not something I would ever even consider panning. I mean, I do love my cooler toned looks once in a while, but this palette, for me at least, it's not really an everyday appropriate palette, so I would struggle with it so much. But you know, not all of my palettes are necessarily something that I, you know, want to pan. And then another palette I don't think I'm going to be depotting right now at least is this one. This is the Juvia's Place, the Nubian eyeshadow palette, the original one. I think the color story of this eyeshadow palette is really cohesive and it really has all of the shades I would need to create a look, except maybe a brow bone highlighter. But overall, I do really like this palette the way it is and I don't see any reason to depot this. Another thing is that in my current extra large C palette, I do have almost every single one of these shades already. That being said, this one I also don't think I would pan because this palette is so warm. All of the looks from this palette are so super warm that I think I would be quite bored if I, you know, panned this one for entire year. But I still do love this palette and I do want to keep this the way it is. Okay, so the rest of these palettes are something that I think I really could depot all of them. But let's still go through them one by one. First, the Jeffree Star Cosmetics Androgyny eyeshadow palette. I am a little bit on a hence about this palette. Reason being that I do really appreciate this color story. It's really beautiful. For me, this is a fall time eyeshadow palette. I really wouldn't reach for this palette otherwise than in fall, but the color story is so beautiful. I love how it is a mix of neutrals and colorful eyeshadows. However, I really don't wear colorful eyeshadow that often, and there are certain colorful eyeshadows in this palette that I just don't like and I would like to get rid of. Another thing is that I feel some of these shades, especially Androgyny over here, is something that I really wouldn't use with the rest of the palette, and if I'm going to use that eyeshadow I would anyways reach for another palette or 10 singles. And then with the neutral eyeshadows, I think I would get so much more use out of them if they were not in this packaging. Because if they are in this palette, in this packaging, I will only reach for them in fall. But for example, Frosting over here, it is a beautiful gold that I could really use throughout the entire year if it was in my C palette. So I think I'm going to be depotting this palette, even though I do appreciate the color story. But I think I personally do want to get rid of a couple of the shades, and I do think I can get more use out of all of these shades if they are in my C palette. This palette also I am going to be depotting. This is the Colourpop I Think I Love You palette. I absolutely do love this palette. This is right up my alley. It's a warm neutrals eyeshadow palette, but it's not so warm that everything you're going to create with this palette is going to be orange, like with the Nubian palette from Juvia's Place. So I absolutely love this palette. I might even consider panning it, but there's a couple of issues for me with panning this palette. And the biggest one is that I would run out of my basic mattes way before I would even like hit pan on all of the shimmers. Usually I don't mind if a palette has more shimmers than mattes because I absolutely love to have a shimmery lid color. But you know, panning a palette, I like that there's enough mattes so that I don't need to pull for other palettes right away when I start panning it. And then another reason why I think I want to depot this palette is that I want to have a matte black eyeshadow in my C palette. I don't have one there currently, and I do nowadays like to use matte blacks as eyeliners. If there was in this palette a really dark matte brown instead of the black, maybe then I would not depot this palette and maybe then actually I would pan this. But I think the black in this palette, I think it's like a little bit too harsh. Because the overall vibe of this palette is like really soft and glam, and then the black is kind of like, it's a little bit too much in my opinion. Another reason for me to depot this palette is that this is no longer available, so it's not like I can even recommend this palette anymore, so I'm going to be depotting it. Also, I'm not the biggest fan of the packaging. I mean, it's not ugly, but you know, it's annoying to show on camera because it's so reflective, and especially if I film with a ring light, it's like quite challenging. And then last but okay, maybe least, because this is like one of my least favorite palettes, because I will always need to reach for something else when I use this. But this is the BH Cosmetics Foil Eyes Cool to Go 6-color eyeshadow palette. As you can see, there's only 6 shimmery eyeshadows in this palette. I'm really on a hens about this one. I would really love to depot this palette and get rid of the blue eyeshadow because I don't like it. I do have a better blue in the Juvia's Place the Nubian 2 eyeshadow palette. But then I don't know if I want to go through a trouble of depotting a palette in plastic packaging. But these eyeshadows, I hope you can see that they are actually pressed in pans, so it's not the same situation than with the e.l.f. Prism eyeshadow palette. So it's something you can depot, but yeah, I prefer depotting palettes in cardboard packaging because those I can just rip open. With this one I need to use heat and I'm more likely to have casualties, and I don't want to break these purples because I love them and they are the only really nice shimmery purples I have in my collection. However, I think I am going to be depotting this palette because I will anyways need to reach for something else with this palette, like a matte palette. It doesn't really make a sense for me to keep the palette the way it is, so I am going to take the risk and I am going to be depotting this palette too. Okay, so this is the end result of this video. These 2 piles of palettes I am not going to be depotting, at least for now, but the palettes I will depot now are these 5 eyeshadow palettes over here. So that's what my next video is going to be. I will actually be depotting this palette. I am so excited about that. Thank you so much for watching this video and see you in my next one. Bye bye.